In the British Museum in room 56, within a long glass case of clay fragments gathered from the ruins of ancient Nineveh, rests a tablet catalogued as K5419. It was excavated in 1849 by Austin Henry Layard from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The tablet is not large. It fits comfortably within the span of 2 hands. Its surface is impressed with wedge-shaped cuneiform signs pressed into damp clay nearly 3 millennia ago. The edges are chipped, the corners are worn, yet the inscription remains legible. K5419 preserves a portion of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. It describes a moment of cosmic resolution after divine conflict. The rebel god Kingu is captured, his blood is drawn. Clay from the earth is mixed with that blood. From this mixture, humanity is formed. The text is specific in its sequence. The gods, weary of labor, create humans to bear the burden of maintaining the world. The excavation records are precise. Layard's team documented the chamber in which the tablets were stacked. Later, scholars such as George Smith and L.W. King translated the fragments, cross-referencing parallel tablets to reconstruct damaged lines. Modern philologists continue to refine those translations, debating subtle Akkadian terms for life, breath, and intelligence. The scholarly apparatus surrounding this object is extensive and careful. And yet a quiet tension remains within the text itself. In multiple Mesopotamian sources, not only the Enuma Elish, but also the Atrahasis Epic, there appears an unexpected note: divine dissatisfaction after human creation. The gods complain of noise. They regret their decision. They send plague. They send famine. Eventually, they send flood. Creation is followed by anxiety. Imagine standing before the glass case. The lighting is subdued, designed to preserve fragile clay. You lean closer, tracing the incised signs with your eyes. Each wedge mark represents deliberate motion of a stylus into soft earth. The words were once recited aloud in temple courtyards. They were memorized, copied, preserved. Now they sit in silence. You notice how ordinary the tablet appears. It is not monumental. It does not declare itself extraordinary. Yet the narrative it carries is expansive. Gods at war, blood mixed with soil, humans shaped from divine residue. And then regret. Why would a culture encode divine fear so close to divine creation? Why would the beings who fashioned humanity quickly seek to limit or erase it? The text does not dramatize this tension. It presents it as fact. The gods grow disturbed by their own solution. What was intended to relieve labor becomes a new problem. Creation contains its own contradiction. This pattern is subtle, but it is consistent. Before widening into speculation, it is important to remain here with the artifact itself, with the clay, with the documented excavation, with the careful chain of translation that links ancient Nineveh to a modern museum case. Authority comes first. The anomaly follows. The tablet does not shout its mystery. It rests quietly within established scholarship. Yet the sequence of creation and regret persists across related texts, copied by scribes who had no incentive to preserve divine weakness unless it held meaning. Something in the structure of the story mattered. It is from this small object, catalogued and numbered, that the inquiry begins. Not from conjecture, but from clay impressed by human hands nearly 3,000 years ago. As we continue, You may notice how origin stories shape your own sense of purpose and vulnerability. To listen to them carefully is not to accept them uncritically, but to consider what they reveal about how civilizations understood themselves and how we understand ourselves now. Within modern scholarship, the Mesopotamian creation accounts are generally approached not as literal cosmology, but as reflections of social structure. The Egypt in Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis Epic are read as theological narratives embedded within political realities. They emerge from complex urban societies in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, where irrigation, agriculture, and centralized authority required coordinated labor on an immense scale. In this context, the gods who complain of exhaustion can be understood as symbolic projections of ruling elites. The lesser deities in the Atrahasis Epic are described as digging canals, maintaining fields, and performing tasks that mirror the agricultural burdens of human workers. When they rebel against this labor, the higher gods devise a solution: create humans to assume the workload. From this perspective, the myth encodes a justification for hierarchy. Humanity is fashioned to serve. The divine order reflects the earthly one. The Atrahasis Epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets dating to approximately the 17th century BCE, elaborates this framework in detail. The text describes overpopulation leading to divine irritation. Humans multiply. Their noise disturbs the gods. The response unfolds in stages: first plague, then drought, then famine. Each calamity is followed by human adaptation and survival, often aided by the god Enki, who quietly subverts harsher divine decrees. Eventually, the flood is sent as a final corrective measure. Scholars often interpret this sequence as allegory for environmental stress within early Mesopotamian city-states. Rapid urban growth would have strained irrigation systems and agricultural output. Flooding from the Tigris and Euphrates was both life-giving and destructive. The myth may preserve a cultural memory of real ecological cycles, refracted through divine narrative. In this reading, the gods are literary devices. They personify natural forces and political realities. Divine anger represents drought. Divine regret represents social instability. The flood reflects catastrophic inundation events documented in sediment layers at sites such as Shuruppak and Ur. This framework is not dismissive of the myth's power. It simply situates it within human experience. The Enuma Elish itself was recited during the Babylonian Akitu festival, reinforcing the legitimacy of the reigning monarch as the earthly representative of Marduk, the chief god. By dramatizing cosmic order emerging from chaos, the text affirmed political order emerging from fragmentation. The creation of humanity from divine blood established a theological anthropology. Humans carry a trace of divinity, yet are bound to service. Within academic discourse, this duality is often explained as narrative efficiency. To justify labor, humans must be both subordinate and meaningful. Too low, and obedience collapses into despair. Too elevated, and hierarchy dissolves. The motif of divine regret, therefore, is sometimes interpreted as a cautionary element. It reinforces limits. Humans who multiply excessively or disrupt cosmic balance invite correction. The story becomes instructional. Importantly, mainstream scholarship does not treat these texts as records of extraterrestrial engineering or lost super-civilizations. The methodological approach remains grounded in philology, archaeology, and comparative literature. Interpretations are constrained by material evidence and historical context. And yet, even within this framework, the sequence remains curious. If the myth serves to stabilize hierarchy, why preserve divine vulnerability? Why portray the creators as uncertain about their own design? It would have been simpler to depict humanity as permanently obedient, permanently controlled. Instead, the texts introduce friction. This tension does not invalidate the socio-political reading. Rather, it complicates it. Ancient scribes were capable of layered storytelling. A myth can simultaneously legitimize authority and acknowledge its fragility. It can justify labor while hinting that power is never entirely secure. The academic position encourages caution. It reminds us that these were human compositions shaped by cultural needs. It protects against projecting modern anxieties onto ancient clay. But it also leaves space. Space for noticing patterns that extend beyond immediate utility. Space for recognizing that civilizations sometimes encode their fears in the very stories meant to stabilize them. Within the accepted framework, the gods represent institutions. Their complaints reflect pressures. Their corrections symbolize recalibration. Yet the structure remains consistent: creation, multiplication, disturbance, correction. A cycle. And cycles, once noticed, tend to reappear. For now, we remain with an established interpretation. The tablets are literary artifacts. The myths are social mirrors. The divine anxiety is metaphorical. But metaphors often reveal more than they conceal. To move beyond general interpretation, it is necessary to return to the language itself. The Atrahasis Epic and the Enuma Elish do not simply state that humans were formed from earth. They describe a specific act: the mixing of clay with the blood of a defeated god. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk overcomes Tiamat and secures divine supremacy, the assembly of gods confronts a practical dilemma. Labor remains burdensome. Order requires maintenance. It is decided that Kingu, the commander of Tiamat's forces and bearer of the Tablet of Destinies, will be executed. His blood will be used to fashion humanity. The Akkadian line reads with deliberate precision: "They bound him and held him before Ea. They imposed the penalty on him and severed his blood vessels. From his blood he created mankind." The verb forms are procedural. There is no flourish. The sequence is administrative. In Atrahasis, a parallel scene unfolds. The god We'ila, associated with intelligence or spirit, is sacrificed. His flesh and blood are mixed with clay. The text uses the term etemu, often translated as ghost or spirit, suggesting that something of divine consciousness enters the human form. This detail matters. Humans are not shaped solely from inert matter. They contain residue of rebellion. The god whose blood animates them was not loyal. He stood against authority. His execution precedes human emergence. Creation contains its own contradiction. Philologists have long debated the nuances of these passages. The Akkadian word temu can mean reason, plan, or intelligence. In some translations, humanity is granted not only life, but deliberative capacity. The divine element is cognitive, not merely biological. This complicates the labor metaphor. If humans were intended purely as workers, why endow them with reflective intelligence? Why emphasize that the animating principle derives from a rebel deity rather than a compliant one? One explanation is narrative economy. A dramatic sacrifice heightens the gravity of creation. Another is theological symmetry. Rebellion produces consequence, and consequence produces new order. But the structure remains intriguing. The god who resisted authority becomes the substance of those who will eventually challenge it again. The myth does not hide this lineage. It preserves it. The rebel's blood flows forward into human consciousness. Imagine the scribe pressing stylus into clay, recording this sequence line by line. He does not omit the rebellion. He does not soften the execution. He inscribes it as foundational. This suggests intentionality. In both epics, humanity is born from crisis. The divine assembly acts under pressure. Labor has become unsustainable. Order is fragile. The solution is radical. Create a new being to absorb the strain. Yet that being carries within it the memory of insurrection. The Atrahasis text further reinforces tension by describing humanity as capable of multiplying rapidly. Their numbers increase. Their presence becomes disruptive. The gods attempt incremental corrections, each failing to restore equilibrium permanently. It is as though the initial design contained instability from the beginning. Creation contains its own contradiction. This phrase does not appear verbatim in the tablets, but the pattern suggests it. The divine solution introduces new variables. The rebel's essence, once embedded in human form, cannot be entirely controlled. Intelligence fosters adaptation. Adaptation fosters growth. Growth generates noise. The gods respond with restriction. One interpretation suggests that this sequence encodes ancient observations about unintended consequences. Technological or social innovations often produce benefits alongside new complications. The myth dramatizes this dynamic through divine narrative. Another way to read the passage is more existential. By tracing human consciousness to divine rebellion, the text situates questioning at the core of identity. Doubt is not deviation, it is inheritance. The rebel's blood does not vanish with execution, it diffuses into clay. Within the Atrahasis Epic, the goddess Nintu participates in shaping the first humans. She mixes clay and divine substance while reciting incantations. The scene is ritualistic, birth is sacred, but the materials remain fraught. Clay is earthbound, blood is volatile. The combination produces a being both grounded and restless. Scholars caution against overextension. The myth need not encode advanced anthropology. It may simply reflect narrative creativity. Yet the recurrence of rebellion as precursor to humanity remains a structural constant across versions. This is not a peripheral detail, it is central. Humans emerge from conflict within the divine realm. They inherit complexity rather than simplicity. Their origin is not harmonious but negotiated. And if that is the case, the later divine anxiety takes on a different tone. It is not surprise at human behavior, it may be recognition. Recognition that the seeds of instability were present from the beginning. The clay tablet does not declare this interpretation, it allows it. In the measured language of cuneiform, pressed into wet earth under Assyrian light, the story preserves its paradox. Humans are created to stabilize the cosmos, yet they carry within them the very force that destabilizes authority. Creation contains its own contradiction. If human consciousness emerges from divine rebellion, the next movement in the narrative becomes easier to understand. The flood accounts do not begin with arbitrary destruction. They unfold as response. In the Atrahasis Epic, the problem is articulated in surprisingly mundane terms. Humanity has multiplied. Their noise has become excessive. The Akkadian word often translated as noise, rigmu, can imply clamour, disturbance, unrest. It is not merely sound, it suggests disruption of order. The chief god Enlil cannot sleep. The text describes his irritation growing steadily. First comes plague, then drought, then famine. Each affliction reduces the human population temporarily. Each time, humanity adapts. Enki, the god associated with wisdom and subterranean waters, quietly instructs survivors how to endure. The balance tips back and forth. Eventually, the assembly resolves upon a flood. The decision is procedural. It is voted. Oaths are sworn to secrecy. The plan is systematic. The destruction is meant to be total. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves a related account, transmitted centuries later. Utnapishtim recounts how he was warned by Ea, who spoke through the wall of a reed hut, advising him to dismantle his house and build a vessel. The language is calm. Instructions are given in dimensions and materials. The catastrophe is described not with hysteria, but with inevitability. Genesis 6, though shaped by a different theological framework, carries an echo of the same structure. The deity observes that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that the earth was filled with violence. Regret is expressed. A flood is sent. Across these texts, the divine stance shifts from creator to corrector. The pattern is consistent. Human proliferation leads to divine anxiety. Correction follows creation. Power fears what it produces. The phrase does not appear in any ancient manuscript, yet the narrative sequence suggests its logic. In Atrahasis, the gods did not miscalculate unknowingly. They were aware that humanity carried divine intelligence. Still, they seem surprised by its consequences. The flood is framed as necessary restoration. Yet even here, ambiguity lingers. Enki's intervention ensures survival. He subverts the totality of destruction. After the waters recede, new measures are instituted. Limitations on fertility. Mortality fixed as universal. The establishment of priestesses who do not bear children. The text reads almost like demographic policy. It is administrative myth-making. Scholars interpret these passages as reflections of real flood events in Mesopotamia. Archaeological layers at Shuruppak and Kish reveal sediment deposits consistent with localized inundations around the early 3rd millennium BCE. Oral memory of catastrophic flooding could have crystallized into literary form. Divine regret would then symbolize human vulnerability to environmental forces. This explanation is compelling. It grounds narrative in geography. Yet the recurrence of divine anxiety remains striking. The gods do not simply respond to chaos, they regret their own design. In Genesis, the phrase, "It repented the Lord that he had made man," is unusually intimate. In Atrahasis, Enlil's frustration is personal. Sleep is disturbed, authority is irritated. The flood becomes less an external disaster and more a recalibration of power. One interpretation suggests that these accounts encode ancient awareness of population dynamics. Urban centers in Mesopotamia could grow rapidly, stressing irrigation networks. Social unrest might be framed as divine displeasure. Flood narratives would then function as moralized environmental memory. Another way to read the structure is more psychological. The myth dramatizes the tension between control and autonomy. Humanity, endowed with intelligence, inevitably expands beyond initial expectations. The creator confronts the limits of governance. This tension is not resolved by the flood, it is deferred. After the waters recede, humanity resumes. Mortality becomes central. Lifespans shorten. The divine realm withdraws slightly from direct engagement. A new equilibrium is established, but it is cautious. This has happened before. The sense of recurrence is embedded within the textual rhythm. Creation, growth, disturbance, correction, survival, restriction. Cycles are easier to remember than singular events. In each account, the flood is not absolute erasure. It is partial reset. The world continues, altered but not extinguished. Memory survives collapse. The scribe copying these lines, centuries, later preserves both destruction and preservation. He does not omit divine vulnerability, he inscribes it again. And so the anomaly persists. If the purpose of myth was solely to affirm unassailable divine authority, regret would be unnecessary, anxiety would be hidden. Instead, the narratives retain it. The gods are powerful, but they are not indifferent. They respond, they recalibrate, they fear imbalance. Power fears what it produces. The flood accounts, read carefully, do not shout catastrophe. They describe adjustment. The scale is immense, yet the tone remains measured. Divine decisions are deliberated. Survival is permitted. Life resumes under new constraints. In this rhythm, one senses neither simple wrath nor arbitrary destruction. One senses management of a volatile creation. And perhaps beneath the clay and ink, an acknowledgement that intelligence once granted cannot be fully recalled. Long before the standardized Akkadian versions of Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish were copied into Assyrian libraries, another document was circulating among Mesopotamian scribes. It was not myth in the conventional sense, it was administrative, sequential, almost austere in tone. The Sumerian king list. Fragments of this text have been recovered from multiple sites, including Nippur and Lhasa, with the most complete manuscript known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, dated to around 1800 BCE, and now housed in the Ashmolean Museum. The document lists kings who ruled in Sumer, organized by city, beginning in a time before a great flood. Its opening line is deceptively simple. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What follows is a series of rulers whose reigns stretch across astonishing spans of time. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar for 36,000 years. In total, 8 antediluvian kings governed for a combined 241,200 years before the flood sweeps across the land. Then the text states, with minimal elaboration, then the flood swept over. After this event, the pattern shifts. Kingship descends from heaven again. Rule resumes in Kish, but the reign lengths contract dramatically. Instead of tens of thousands of years, rulers govern for hundreds, then decades. Gradually, the durations approximate historical plausibility. Scholars interpret the exaggerated lifespans symbolically. The antediluvian kings represent mythic time, a distant age of cosmic proximity. The flood serves as dividing marker between primordial and historical eras. The contraction of reign lengths reflects transition from mythic grandeur to human limitation. This explanation aligns with comparative mythic structures found elsewhere. Yet the structural detail remains notable. The flood does not merely destroy population. It alters temporal scale. It reduces duration. It diminishes longevity. Something changes in the fabric of rule. The text does not dramatize this contraction. It records it, calmly, sequentially. The effect is subtle but profound. Before the flood, Kingship appears nearly eternal. Afterward, it becomes finite. This has happened before. The phrase echoes softly across narratives. In Atrahasis, divine measures are introduced to limit human fertility. In Genesis, lifespans shorten dramatically after the flood, declining from hundreds of years to near contemporary spans within a few generations. The king list encodes the same shift without commentary. One could argue that this pattern reflects evolving historiography. As scribes approached periods closer to their own time, they recorded more realistic reign lengths. Mythic inflation gives way to administrative record. That interpretation is reasonable, yet the placement of the flood as boundary between magnified and diminished existence invites reflection. The event does not end kingship, it recalibrates it. Authority persists, but its duration contracts. Memory survives collapse. The king list is not overtly theological. It does not describe divine regret. It does not narrate human noise. It simply organizes rule around a dividing catastrophe. And in doing so, it preserves continuity alongside rupture. If we read the text structurally rather than literally, the antediluvian age represents expansive possibility. The post-diluvian era introduces constraint. Time itself appears compressed. Creation contains its own contradiction. The kings before the flood rule almost beyond time, yet their era is fragile. It ends abruptly. The kings after the flood rule within measurable limits, yet their succession becomes stable and traceable. One interpretation suggests that the king list encodes a civilizational memory of transformation. Perhaps not a single global flood, but a series of destabilizing events, climatic, social, ecological, that reshaped political continuity. The flood becomes shorthand for transition from one order to another. Another way to read it is more symbolic. The mythic past reflects humanity's longing for permanence. The historical present acknowledges mortality. The flood is narrative hinge between aspiration and realism. In either case, the structure aligns with earlier patterns. There is an initial state of grandeur. There is a disruption. There is survival. There is reduction. This has happened before. The scribe who carved the prism into baked clay did not annotate his intention. He listed kings. He noted the flood. He resumed the sequence. Yet in the contraction of years, something of divine withdrawal is implied. Authority remains, but its aura shifts. The king list stands quietly beside the epics. It does not recount divine frustration, yet it reflects the aftermath of divine intervention. It does not describe fear, yet it records limitation. In this administrative document, myth and memory intertwine. The flood becomes chronological pivot. The world continues, but under altered parameters. Time, once expansive, becomes measured, and perhaps that is another form of correction. Far from the river valleys of Mesopotamia, across oceans and separated by millennia of independent development, another creation account unfolds within the highlands of Mesoamerica. The Popol Vuh, preserved in a 16th century Quiche Maya manuscript transcribed in Latin script, recounts a series of attempts by divine beings to fashion humanity. The structure is iterative. In the Popol Vuh, the first humans are formed from mud. They dissolve. They cannot stand. The second are carved from wood. They speak, but they lack understanding. They forget the gods. They multiply excessively. They become disruptive. The deities send destruction. A rain of resin falls. The earth trembles. Wooden peoples scatter and are annihilated. Only in a later attempt, when humans are formed from maize, does stability emerge. The details differ from Mesopotamian clay and divine blood, yet the pattern resonates. Creation is not singular, it is experimental. The first designs fail, the creators adjust. Destruction precedes refinement. This has happened before. Scholars caution against assuming direct cultural transmission between ancient Mesopotamia and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. There is no credible archaeological evidence of contact sufficient to transmit mythic structures across such distances in antiquity. The similarities are structural rather than genealogical. That distinction matters. The Popol Vuh does not frame divine frustration in precisely the same terms as Atrahasis. The issue is not noise, but inadequacy and forgetfulness. The wooden people fail to honor their makers. They lack interior depth. They lack memory. Memory survives collapse. After their destruction, remnants endure as monkeys, according to the narrative. The myth preserves continuity even in failure. The cycle of creation and correction continues until a viable balance is achieved. One interpretation suggests that these iterative myths reflect agricultural experimentation. Early so, communities would have experienced crop failure and adaptation. Maize, as staple grain, becomes symbol of successful human design. The narrative encodes subsistence realities within cosmological metaphor. Another way to read the pattern is more psychological. The repeated attempts at creation mirror human self-understanding. Societies continually reshape their institutions, their identities, their technologies. Failure becomes precursor to refinement. Power fears what it produces. In the Popol Vuh, the gods are not passive observers. They intervene decisively when their creations exceed boundaries or lack reverence. The structure parallels Mesopotamian flood narratives in its insistence that imbalance invites correction. Yet the tone remains measured. The text does not revel in destruction. It treats it as necessary recalibration. Across continents, separated by geography and language, a similar narrative rhythm appears. Divine initiative, flawed humanity. Corrective catastrophe. Renewed creation. Creation contains its own contradiction. The clay of Mesopotamia and the maize of Mesoamerica are not identical symbols. Yet both embed humanity within agricultural substance. Both situate origin within material intimately tied to survival. Both describe instability within the first design. Scholars often attribute such parallels to universal cognitive patterns. Human societies everywhere confront birth, growth, failure, and renewal. Myth becomes structured reflection of lived experience. No shared source is required for shared themes to emerge. This explanation is persuasive, yet the recurrence of cyclical correction invites contemplation. The mythic memory of failed generations appears in disparate cultures, each preserving a sense that the present order was not inevitable, but achieved after disruption. This has happened before. Whether through flood, resin rain, or symbolic transformation, humanity emerges through stages. The creators adjust. The world is remade. The pattern is not proof of hidden connection. It is evidence of recurring narrative architecture. And narrative architecture often reveals how civilizations understand instability, not as anomaly, but as phase. In ancient Greece, centuries after the earliest Sumerian tablets were inscribed, the poet Hesiod composed works and days. Within this didactic poem appears a sequence now known as the Ages of Man. It is not framed as administrative record, nor as divine assembly drama. It is reflective, almost pastoral in tone. Hesiod describes 5 successive ages: gold, silver, bronze, the age of heroes, and iron. In the Golden Age, humans lived in harmony with the gods. They required no toil. The earth yielded freely. Death came gently, like sleep. There was proximity to the divine without anxiety. Then decline begins. The Silver Age is marked by immaturity and impiety. Humans neglect the gods. They are destroyed. The Bronze Age is violent, consumed by warfare. It ends in self-destruction. The Age of Heroes briefly restores nobility, only to yield finally to the Iron Age, Hesiod's present, characterized by hardship, injustice, and moral decay. The structure is sequential contraction. Unlike Mesopotamian flood accounts, there is no singular catastrophic deluge dividing eras. Instead, deterioration unfolds gradually. Divine human harmony diminishes across stages. Lifespans shorten. Ease gives way to labor. Trust gives way to suspicion. This has happened before. The Golden Age mirrors, in conceptual outline, the antediluvian era of expansive kingship. An initial state of proximity and abundance is followed by fracture. In Hesiod's telling, Zeus withdraws progressively. Humanity becomes more distant from divine oversight. Scholars interpret the ages of man as moral allegory rather than historical memory. The sequence reflects agrarian hardship and generational pessimism. Each age encodes shifting social realities within mythic frame. The decline from gold to iron symbolizes perceived erosion of virtue. That interpretation is grounded and compelling, yet the pattern remains aligned with earlier narratives. Creation or emergence begins in harmony. Human behavior introduces imbalance. Correction or decline follows. The present age is framed as diminished relative to a remembered ideal. Power fears what it produces. In Hesiod's account, the gods do not explicitly regret creating humanity. Instead, they respond to human corruption with withdrawal and punishment. The dynamic is less administrative than ethical. Still, the trajectory is similar: proximity, excess, correction. Creation contains its own contradiction. Even within the Golden Age, the seeds of decline are implied. No age remains static. The movement toward iron appears inevitable. Hesiod's tone is not sensational, it is resigned. He speaks as observer of long arc rather than participant in singular catastrophe. The Greek narrative, like its Mesopotamian counterparts, situates the present as aftermath. Humanity lives in a diminished era, aware of lost grandeur. Memory survives collapse. Whether this memory reflects actual historical transition or symbolic longing is debated. Some scholars propose that the myth preserves distant echoes of Bronze Age collapse around the 12th century BCE, when Mycenaean palaces fell and trade networks fractured. Others view it purely as poetic device. What matters here is structure. Across cultures, separated by language and geography, the idea recurs. Humanity begins in closer alignment with divine or cosmic order. Something shifts. A boundary is crossed. Correction or contraction follows. The present stands downstream from rupture. This has happened before. The recurrence does not prove shared origin. It suggests shared narrative instinct. Civilizations frame themselves within cycles of ascent and decline. They embed anxiety about progress within stories of divine-human relationship. Hesiod does not mention clay or blood. He does not describe flood. Yet he encodes the same subtle tension. Power withdrawn, humanity left to navigate diminished world. In this pattern recognition, the inquiry widens gently. If civilizations repeatedly encode divine withdrawal or correction, what collective intuition might be preserved beneath myth? Leaving the realm of text for a moment, the inquiry turns to sediment and ice. Around 12,800 years ago, near the end of the last ice age, Earth experienced an abrupt climatic reversal known as the Younger Dryas. After millennia of gradual warming, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped sharply within decades. Glacial conditions returned, ecosystems shifted, megafauna declined. This event is recorded not in myth, but in stratigraphy. Ice cores extracted from Greenland, particularly from the GISP2 and GRIP projects, preserve annual layers of snowfall compressed into ice. Within these cores, oxygen isotope ratios reveal sudden temperature shifts. The data show a dramatic cooling at the onset of the Younger Dryas, followed by equally abrupt warming approximately 1,200 years later. Lake sediments and pollen records across Europe and North America confirm widespread ecological disruption. Vegetation zones shifted southward. Dry conditions prevailed in some regions, while meltwater pulses altered coastlines elsewhere. The cause remains debated. One widely discussed hypothesis proposes that massive freshwater discharge from proglacial Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic disrupted thermohaline circulation, weakening the Gulf Stream and triggering rapid cooling. Another, more controversial proposal suggests a cometary impact or airburst event at the Younger Dryas boundary, citing microspherules, platinum anomalies, and possible impact proxies at multiple sites. This latter theory remains contested within the geological community. What is not contested is the climatic instability itself. Human populations at the time were hunter-gatherers dispersed across varied landscapes. Archaeological evidence indicates that some communities adapted successfully, while others disappeared. In the Levant, the Natufian culture shows signs of semi-sedentary settlement prior to the Younger Dryas, followed by disruption and reorganization. Environmental shock can reshape social patterns. It is tempting to draw direct lines between such climatic events and later flood narratives. Caution is necessary. The temporal gap between the Younger Dryas and the composition of Mesopotamian epics spans thousands of years. Oral memory rarely remains precise across such distances, yet deep memory can persist structurally. If we consider the possibility that ancient flood stories encode cultural remembrance of earlier environmental instability, the Younger Dryas offers a plausible context for widespread disruption. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age inundated vast coastal plains. The Persian Gulf Basin, for instance, would have transformed from habitable land to submerged sea over millennia. Communities living along ancient shorelines may have witnessed gradual encroachment of water, punctuated by sudden surges. Memory survives collapse. The geological record does not speak in narrative. It records temperature shifts, sediment deposition, extinction patterns. It doesn't attribute agency. It does not express regret. Yet when ancient texts describe flood as corrective measure following imbalance, the image resonates differently when set against real episodes of environmental volatility. Catastrophe need not be purely metaphorical. This has happened before. Climatic systems oscillate. Stability gives way to disruption. Human societies adapt or perish. The Younger Dryas stands as reminder that large-scale change can occur within lifetimes. scholars caution against conflating geological events with mythic timelines. The evidence for direct continuity remains limited, but the plausibility of environmental memory embedded within narrative cannot be dismissed entirely. If ancient communities experienced abrupt shifts in climate or sea level, the imprint of those events could reverberate through generations, eventually crystallizing into stories of divine correction. Creation contains its own contradiction. Agriculture emerges in the Near East shortly after the Younger Dryas ends. Some researchers propose that environmental stress encouraged experimentation with cultivation. Instability may have catalyzed innovation. Correction may have preceded complexity. The scientific record grounds the inquiry in measurable data. It reminds us that Earth's systems are dynamic. Floods, droughts, temperature shifts. These are not solely literary devices. They are part of planetary history. Whether or not specific myths encode specific events, the existence of profound climatic disruption in humanity's deep past adds weight to the possibility that stories of divine recalibration reflect more than imagination alone. They may reflect adaptation to a world that changes. If climate shifts represent environmental recalibration, genetics offers another layer of measurable continuity. Within the DNA of modern populations, traces of contraction and expansion remain visible. These traces do not narrate events in mythic language, yet they record demographic turbulence. One widely discussed example is the proposed population bottleneck associated with the Toba supereruption approximately 74,000 years ago. Geological evidence from Sumatra indicates that this volcanic event released enormous quantities of ash into the atmosphere. Some researchers have suggested that resulting climatic cooling may have reduced human populations significantly, perhaps to a few thousand breeding individuals. This hypothesis remains debated, as archaeological sites in Africa and South Asia show signs of continued habitation through the period. Even without accepting an extreme bottleneck, genetic studies consistently reveal episodes of contraction within human evolutionary history. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analyses allow researchers to trace maternal and paternal lineages backward in time. These methods do not pinpoint singular catastrophes with precision, but they reveal fluctuations in effective population size. Periods of expansion often follow constraints. Population does not increase linearly. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene periods, encompassing the Younger Dryas and subsequent warming, show evidence of human groups expanding into newly habitable territories as ice retreated. Coastal populations likely migrated as sea levels rose, abandoning submerged lands and moving inland. Such transitions are not always gradual. If we consider the possibility that repeated environmental stress produced cycles of dispersal and recolonization, then myths of destruction followed by renewal acquire demographic plausibility. They need not describe total annihilation. Partial reset is sufficient. Memory survives collapse. Genetic continuity confirms that humanity did not vanish entirely at any recent point in prehistory. There is no evidence for extinction followed by recreation, but there is evidence for contraction followed by growth. This has happened before. In the context of flood narratives, it is notable that survival often centers on a single family or small group. Atrahasis and his household, Utnapishtim and his kin, Noah and his descendants. From limited seed, humanity expands anew. The structure mirrors demographic rebound after population stress. Scholars urge restraint in correlating myth with genetics. The timelines differ, the mechanisms differ. Myths are shaped by culture, not chromosomes. Yet the structural resonance remains intriguing. Power fears what it produces. In biological terms, population growth can strain ecological balance. Overextension invites correction through famine, disease, or migration. These processes are impersonal, governed by environmental constraints rather than divine will. Yet ancient observers, lacking modern ecological theory, might have interpreted such cycles as intentional recalibration by higher powers. Genetic research also reveals something else: diversity within unity. All modern humans share remarkably recent common ancestry. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam are not singular progenitors but statistical convergences within larger populations. Still, their conceptual framing echoes mythic language. Humanity emerges from limited lineage. Creation contains its own contradiction. Biological inheritance equips humans with adaptability and intelligence, traits that foster survival but also enable rapid expansion. Expansion generates complexity. Complexity produces vulnerability. The genetic record does not narrate divine regret. It records mutation rates, haplogroup distributions, and migration pathways. It shows that our species has endured fluctuations without losing continuity. If ancient myths preserve a memory of correction following excess, the demographic record provides parallel structure. Growth and constraint interweave across millennia. Stability is temporary. This does not confirm that gods feared humanity in literal sense. It suggests that cycles of population stress and recovery are intrinsic to human history. Stories of flood and reset may encode collective awareness of this rhythm. Memory survives collapse. The data do not destabilize credibility. They reinforce it. They remind us that beneath narrative symbolism lies measurable continuity. Humanity has endured contractions before. It has expanded again. And in that expansion, new tensions inevitably arise. As the Younger Dryas ended and global temperatures stabilized approximately 11,700 years ago, conditions across the Near East became more conducive to sustained settlement. In the region known as the Fertile Crescent, communities that had previously relied on hunting and gathering began to experiment more intensively with cultivation. Wild stands of einkorn and emmer wheat were harvested systematically. Goats and sheep were managed, then domesticated. This transition did not occur overnight. Archaeological layers at sites such as Jericho, Sionu, and Abu Huraira reveal gradual shifts in subsistence strategies. Stone tools evolve. Storage pits appear. Architectural remains suggest increasing permanence. Agriculture alters more than diet. It restructures social organization. Surplus enables specialization. Specialization encourages hierarchy. Hierarchy requires governance. Power emerges from productivity. In southeastern Anatolia, at a hilltop site known as Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists led by Klaus Schmidt uncovered massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, before clear evidence of widespread agriculture in the region. The pillars are carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, serpents, vultures. The scale of the architecture implies coordinated labor and symbolic intent. This sequence challenges earlier assumptions that agriculture preceded monumental ritual construction. Here, ritual appears first, or at least concurrently. If symbolic cognition predates structured farming, then the impulse to organize collective meaning may have catalyzed economic transformation. Communities gathered to build, and in building, reconfigured their subsistence patterns. Creation contains its own contradiction. The shift from foraging to farming increased food security in some contexts, yet it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Dependence on specific crops heightened risk of famine. Sedentary life facilitated disease transmission. Social stratification intensified. Stability produced fragility. Scholars interpret these developments through environmental and demographic lenses. As post-glacial climates stabilized, plant resources became more predictable. Population density increased. Cultivation became advantageous. No divine intervention is required to explain this process. Yet the structural parallel with myth remains notable. Human innovation, agriculture, architecture, governance, expands capacity. Expansion generates complexity. Complexity invites tension. Authority arises to manage it. Power fears what it produces. In mythic terms, humanity's growth disturbed divine rest. In historical terms, population growth strained ecological systems. The pattern is not identical, but it resonates. The Neolithic revolution represents one of the most profound recalibrations in human history. It reshaped diet, settlement, labor, and belief. Over centuries, it laid foundations for urban civilization in Mesopotamia. Cities emerged along the Tigris and Euphrates. Irrigation networks multiplied. Writing developed to track grain, labor, and taxation. The same societies that inscribed creation myths also engineered canal systems and codified law. Intelligence amplified power. If we consider the possibility that myths of divine anxiety encode cultural reflection on rapid transformation, the agricultural transition provides context. Human societies altered their environment dramatically. Forests were cleared, fields expanded, watercourses redirected. Creation is not limited to divine narrative. Humans became creators as well, reshaping landscapes and generating surplus. And with creation comes consequence. The archaeological record demonstrates that early farming communities experienced cycles of growth and collapse. Soil salinization in southern Mesopotamia, for example, reduced agricultural yields over time. Shifts in river courses displaced settlements. Political centers rose and fell. This has happened before. Civilization itself appears as iterative experiment. Cities flourish. They strain resources. They decline. New centers emerge. The scientific evidence does not confirm that gods feared humanity. It reveals that human capacity to transform. Environment carries inherent instability. The very innovations that sustain societies can undermine them. Memory survives collapse. Göbekli Tepe was eventually buried intentionally. The reason remains uncertain. Later, Neolithic communities constructed new ritual sites elsewhere. Cultural forms evolved. The impulse to build persisted. The agricultural revolution and its cognitive shifts expanded human agency. They intensified complexity. They amplified both resilience and vulnerability. If ancient myths dramatized divine recalibration in response to human expansion, the historical record shows that expansion itself invites recalibration, even without divine agency. Creation contains its own contradiction. From clay and blood in narrative to stone pillars and domesticated grain in archaeology, humanity's story unfolds through cycles of innovation and adjustment. The pattern remains steady. Having moved through text, climate, genetics, and early civilization, the inquiry now widens. Carefully. The ancient narratives may be read strictly as theological metaphor. They may encode environmental memory. They may reflect social hierarchy. Each interpretation stands on its own evidence. Yet one interpretation suggests another layer. If we consider the possibility that divine anxiety in these myths encodes elite concern about emergent autonomy, the stories take on a different texture. In Atrahasis, humanity is created to relieve labor. The solution functions initially. But as population increases, the balance shifts. Humans become numerous. They generate collective force. Noise disturbs sleep. One way to read this is ecological. Another is political. Rapid population growth in early urban centers could strain not only resources, but governance. Authority confronted masses whose cooperation was necessary, yet unpredictable. Power fears what it produces. The rebel god's blood within humanity becomes symbolic of latent dissent. Intelligence once granted cannot be withdrawn. Literacy, once developed, spreads. Agricultural surplus, once generated, supports specialization beyond direct control. The myth may encode awareness that centralized systems generate complexity that exceeds initial design. This is not to claim that ancient rulers consciously embedded coded warnings within sacred text. Rather, narrative often reflects lived tension without deliberate conspiracy. Scribes preserve stories that resonated with experience. Divine complaint mirrors administrative strain. If we extend this line of thought cautiously, parallels with modern systems appear. Industrialization expanded human capacity dramatically. Mechanization relieved physical labor, much as humans relieved divine toil in myth. Yet industrial growth produced urban overcrowding, labor unrest, and environmental degradation. Governments responded with regulation, reform, and occasionally suppression. Automation in the contemporary era follows similar trajectory. Machines are developed to increase efficiency. Artificial intelligence expands cognitive reach. As systems become more autonomous, questions of control intensify. Power fears what it produces. One interpretation suggests that the ancient myths capture archetypal dynamics inherent in complex systems. Creation of subordinate agents, whether humans in divine narrative or machines in technological narrative, introduces unpredictability. The creator confronts emergent behavior not fully anticipated. This does not require literal gods. It requires pattern recognition. The flood in this reading symbolizes systemic reset. When growth exceeds governance capacity, collapse or restructuring follows. The myth dramatizes this recalibration in divine terms. Creation contains its own contradiction. If humanity is shaped from divine intelligence, then autonomy is intrinsic. Attempts to suppress autonomy may produce further instability. The narrative cycle of plague, drought, flood reflects escalating measures to restore equilibrium. In modern contexts, economic crashes, environmental crises, and political upheavals function as secular analogues of mythic correction. Systems overshoot limits. Corrections follow. Survival continues under modified constraints. This has happened before. It is important to maintain intellectual restraint. There is no evidence that Atrahasis encodes advanced sociological theory. The texts arise from specific historical contexts. Yet myths endure because they express recurring tensions. If we consider the possibility that divine fear represents structural anxiety inherent in hierarchical creation, then the stories become less about supernatural beings and more about the dynamics of power itself. Power generates agents to extend its reach. Those agents acquire capacity. Capacity evolves into autonomy. Autonomy challenges authority. The cycle is neither malicious nor mystical. It is systemic. Ancient scribes may not have articulated it in modern terms, but their narratives preserve the pattern. The gods do not annihilate humanity completely. They limit it. They negotiate with it. They establish new boundaries. Memory survives collapse. Speculation must remain measured. The myths do not provide blueprint for contemporary governance. They provide narrative reflection on complexity. If they encode anything beyond environmental memory, it may be this. Any act of creation, whether divine or human, carries within it potential for unforeseen consequence. And when consequence emerges, power must decide whether to suppress, adapt, or recalibrate. The structural rhythm has now appeared repeatedly. Creation, expansion, disturbance, recalibration. It emerges in Mesopotamian epics, in Mesoamerican cycles, in Greek decline narratives, and in measurable environmental and demographic shifts. The recurrence invites cautious widening. If we consider the possibility that these myths preserve not isolated memory, but recognition of recurring civilizational resets, the inquiry deepens. Not a single flood, not a singular catastrophe, but repeated thresholds. One interpretation suggests that ancient societies experienced regional collapses significant enough to imprint generational memory. Trade networks fail, irrigation systems degrade, political centers fragment. Oral tradition distills complex decline into singular symbolic event. This has happened before. Archaeology confirms multiple episodes of societal contraction. Around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire fell amid climatic stress and internal instability. In the eastern Mediterranean, the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE dismantled palace cultures and disrupted trade routes. Cities burned, populations dispersed. Literacy declined temporarily in some regions. These events were not global annihilations. They were systemic corrections. Creation contains its own contradiction. Urban concentration fosters innovation, but also vulnerability. Trade interdependence increases prosperity while amplifying risk. When drought, invasion, or internal conflict intersects with complexity, collapse can unfold rapidly. Ancient observers may not have conceptualized these dynamics in analytical terms, yet they experience their effects. Flood becomes metaphor for overwhelming force. Divine decree becomes shorthand for impersonal stress. Some researchers have proposed more controversial possibilities. That advanced but forgotten cultures existed prior to known civilizations, erased by sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. This hypothesis remains speculative and contested. Evidence for highly complex global societies before 10,000 BCE is limited. Archaeological methodology demands material proof. If we consider the possibility cautiously, submerged coastal settlements from earlier periods have indeed been identified. Sites along the continental shelves of India and the Mediterranean indicate human habitation now underwater due to post-glacial sea rise. These were not necessarily advanced civilizations, but they were communities displaced by environmental change. Memory survives collapse. Stories of great cities swallowed by water may echo such experiences. The narrative need not describe technological marvels to preserve emotional truth of loss. Power fears what it produces. When societies achieve unprecedented complexity, they also generate unprecedented fragility. Governance structures expand to manage growth. Expansion intensifies strain. The corrective force, whether drought, invasion, economic breakdown, or environmental change, appears overwhelming, almost divine. The myth simplifies. It condenses multifactorial collapse into singular act of judgment. One interpretation suggests that the repetition of flood and reset motifs reflects intuitive understanding that no order is permanent. Civilizations rise, consolidate, and eventually recalibrate. The correction may not always be catastrophic. Sometimes it is gradual erosion. This has happened before. Speculation must remain disciplined. There is no conclusive evidence that humanity has passed through multiple technologically advanced global civilizations lost to time. But there is abundant evidence of repeated regional collapse and renewal. If ancient narratives magnify these episodes into cosmic drama, they may be preserving structural awareness rather than literal chronology. Creation contains its own contradiction. Each generation inherits systems built by predecessors. Each generation modifies them. At times, modification outpaces stability. The reset may be painful. It may feel like divine withdrawal. Yet survival persists. The widening here does not claim hidden history. It observes pattern. Across myth and material record, expansion and correction interweave. If humanity was created in narrative to relieve divine burden, and if humanity repeatedly expands beyond initial design, then correction becomes embedded within story, not as punishment alone, as recalibration, and recalibration suggests continuity rather than finality. There is another widening available, and it turns inward. If the gods in these narratives express anxiety about their creations, one interpretation suggests that the anxiety may not originate in the heavens at all. It may originate in the human mind. The psychological projection hypothesis proposes that divine fear reflects human fear of its own capacities. When ancient scribes described gods disturbed by human noise, multiplication, or defiance, they may have been externalizing awareness of expanding agency. Humans were becoming powerful. In Mesopotamia, irrigation networks reshaped landscapes. In Mesoamerica, urban centers such as Teotihuacan and later Tikal reorganized vast territories. In Greece, maritime trade connected distant regions. Each step increased human reach. Creation contains its own contradiction. The same intelligence that allows construction enables destruction. The same coordination that builds cities can mobilize armies. Authority grows, yet so does potential for upheaval. If we consider the possibility that myths of divine recalibration mirror apprehension about human self-transformation, the pattern shifts subtly. The gods fear humanity because humanity fears itself. Power fears what it produces. In earlier texts, the creator is divine and the created is human. In modern contexts, the creator is human and the created may be technological systems. Artificial intelligence, automation, biotechnology. These represent extensions of human agency beyond previous boundaries. As capacity expands, so does unease. This parallel must be handled with care. Ancient myths did not anticipate contemporary technology. Yet the structural similarity invites reflection. The narrative of creation, followed by anxiety, is not confined to antiquity. If we consider the possibility that the rebel god's blood symbolizes autonomy embedded within design, then the fear expressed in myth may represent recognition that control is always partial. Once intelligence is distributed, it evolves. Some researchers in psychology suggest that myths encode archetypal tensions between order and chaos, parent and child, creator and creation. The flood becomes symbolic of boundary enforcement when differentiation intensifies. This has happened before. Across developmental stages, autonomy provokes anxiety. Parents create children who eventually exceed parental authority. Societies create institutions that later challenge founders' intentions. Engineers design systems that behave unpredictably in complex environments. Creation contains its own contradiction. The psychological reading does not diminish the power of ancient texts. It reframes them as mirrors. The gods who regret their design may embody collective awareness that innovation introduces instability. If we extend this reflection gently into contemporary experience, we may recognize familiar currents. The nuclear age introduced unprecedented destructive capacity. Climate change reflects cumulative technological expansion. Digital networks amplify voice and volatility simultaneously. Power fears what it produces. This is not indictment. It is observation of systemic tension. Ancient scribes may not have articulated these dynamics analytically, yet their narratives preserve emotional resonance. Creation is celebrated. Creation is questioned. Correction follows. Memory survives collapse. If myths encode projection, they do so because projection serves psychological integration. By attributing anxiety to gods, communities could explore unease safely. Divine narratives externalize internal tension. Speculation must remain conditional. The texts do not declare themselves psychological allegories. They operate within theological frameworks. Yet the recurring motif of divine fear invites contemplation that the fear may be shared. The widening here does not destabilize credibility. It extends perspective. If the gods created humans and later feared them, perhaps the story expresses an enduring truth, that intelligence, once manifested, carries potential beyond the comfort of its origin. And perhaps the unease recorded in clay tablets is not solely about ancient deities. It may be about us. The narrative has moved through tablets, sediments, genomes, and speculative widening. Now it slows. If humanity is described in myth as deliberately fashioned, mixed from clay and divine substance, what does that framing do to identity? Even if understood symbolically, the image remains potent. To be shaped with intention implies purpose. To be shaped from rebellion implies complexity. Creation contains its own contradiction. Imagine for a moment standing again before the clay tablet in room 56, not as a historian tracing philology, but as a listener. The surface is uneven. The wedges are pressed with careful force. The scribe did not hurry. Each sign was deliberate. Picture the mixture described in the text. Earth gathered, blood poured. The two combined into form. You do not need to believe the literal sequence to feel the weight of the metaphor. Clay suggests fragility. Blood suggests vitality. Together they imply embodied intelligence, mortal yet animated. If we consider the possibility that ancient cultures framed humanity as engineered to stabilize cosmic order, then existence becomes participatory. Humans are not incidental, they are solutions. Yet solutions can generate new problems. Power fears what it produces. To be engineered for labor, yet endowed with intelligence, creates tension between duty and autonomy. Even in symbolic reading, the structure remains. You are shaped for a function, but you contain capacity to question that function. What does it mean to inherit the rebel's blood? Perhaps it means that doubt is not deviation. Perhaps it means that creativity and disruption share origin. The myth does not depict humans as purely obedient constructs. It preserves their restlessness. This has happened before. Across generations, individuals inherit systems built by predecessors. They inhabit roles defined by culture. Yet within them resides capacity to revise those roles. The tension between inheritance and innovation echoes the mythic paradox. You may notice how often in your own life, creation and correction intertwine. Projects conceived with clarity evolve into unforeseen complexity. Relationships deepen and require renegotiation. Institutions adapt or fracture. Creation contains its own contradiction. If the flood narratives reflect recalibration, then being engineered does not guarantee permanence. Design can be revised. Parameters can shift. Mortality, in many of the texts, is introduced as boundary to unchecked expansion. This boundary does not negate purpose, it frames it. Imagine standing at night considering the span of human history. The agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, the collapse of empires. Each generation participates in cycles larger than itself. If humanity is metaphorically engineered, perhaps it is engineered for adaptation rather than control. Memory survives collapse. The clay tablet remains intact because it was fired and preserved. The civilization that produced it no longer governs Mesopotamia. Yet the words endure. Identity persists beyond specific structures. To be engineered, even symbolically, may mean to carry both vulnerability and capacity. Clay can crack, blood can pulse, intelligence can question. Creation contains its own contradiction. The descent now becomes quieter. The inquiry shifts from whether gods feared humans to how humans understand themselves. Are we designed for obedience, for stewardship, for expansion, for reflection? The ancient texts do not provide final answers. They offer images, and in those images, perhaps, an invitation to examine the tension between what we inherit and what we create. As the pace continues to soften, the inquiry moves beneath recorded chronology. Beyond tablets and stratigraphy, beyond kings and climatic oscillations, there exists a quieter layer, collective memory. Not memory as precise event recall, but memory as pattern. Psychologist Carl Jung proposed that certain archetypes recur across cultures because they arise from shared structures of the human psyche. Whether or not one accepts the full scope of that theory, it is difficult to ignore the recurrence of similar mythic motifs across distant societies. Flood, fall, decline, renewal. Memory survives collapse. These motifs may function as cultural scar tissue. They form around trauma, environmental, social, psychological, and persist long after specific details fade. The scar does not preserve the wound precisely. It preserves the knowledge that wounding occurred. If we consider the possibility that myths of divine regret encode deep anxiety about instability, then those stories become more than entertainment or doctrine. They become vessels for processing uncertainty. This has happened before. Each generation confronts limits. Crops fail, rivers shift course, leaders fall, empires fragment. The mind seeks narrative coherence. Divine framework provides one language for that coherence. You might notice how easily the pattern surfaces in contemporary discourse. When systems falter, explanations often assume moral tone. Catastrophe is interpreted as consequence. Correction follows excess. power fears what it produces. In psychological terms, this may reflect projection of internal conflict onto external agents. Anxiety about one's own capacity for disruption can be reframed as divine apprehension. The gods fear humanity because humanity senses its own volatility. Creation contains its own contradiction. Within each individual, there exists capacity for construction and deconstruction. You build routines, you revise them, you pursue ambitions, you confront limitations. The cycle repeats. Imagine sitting quietly, aware of the layered past beneath you. The ground holds remnants of previous settlements. The language you speak contains words shaped by centuries of change. The myths you inherit carry residues of older worlds. Memory survives collapse. Civilizations may rise and fall, yet certain narrative structures endure. They adapt to new contexts. They reshape themselves. The flood becomes metaphor for financial crisis, for war, for environmental strain. The gods become abstractions, systems, markets, technologies. This has happened before. The philosophical descent does not seek certainty. It seeks recognition. Beneath historical specifics lies enduring awareness that stability is provisional, that creation is powerful. That power can generate unease. And perhaps that unease is not solely external. It resides within consciousness itself. When ancient scribes inscribed divine anxiety, they may have been giving form to internal tension. The realization that intelligence carries responsibility and responsibility carries risk. Memory survives collapse. The descent now approaches stillness. The patterns are familiar. The repetition is gentle. No grand revelation awaits. Only acknowledgement that beneath the surface of recorded history, beneath even scientific explanation, there exists persistent awareness of cycles. Creation, expansion, correction, renewal. And the quiet understanding that these rhythms are not anomalies, they are part of being human. The movement now widens one final time before settling. Empires feel permanent while they endure. The walls of Nineveh once seemed immovable. The temples of Babylon were engineered to outlast generations. The scribes who copied the Enuma Elish didn't imagine their libraries buried beneath desert soil. Yet time exceeds architecture. If we extend perspective beyond individual civilizations, beyond single climatic episodes, a longer arc emerges. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Agriculture occupies only a fraction of that span. Written language an even smaller interval. This has happened before, not in identical form, but in structural recurrence. Communities coalesce, they innovate, they expand, they fracture, they reorganize. Power fears what it produces. Authority consolidates to manage complexity. Complexity multiplies variables beyond full control. Correction follows expansion, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. Creation contains its own contradiction. Within deep time, the rise and fall of empires resembles brief pulses. The Akkadian Empire endured roughly 2 centuries. The Roman Empire in the West, about 5. Modern nation-states measure their histories in similar spans. Imagine stepping back further still. Continents shift over millions of years. Glacial cycles advance and retreat. Species emerge and vanish. Humanity occupies a narrow band within geological chronology. Memory survives collapse. The clay tablet in room 56 is small against that backdrop. Yet it carries forward a voice from 3,000 years ago. It bridges eras. It reminds us that awareness of impermanence is not new. If the gods feared humanity in ancient narratives, perhaps the fear reflects recognition that intelligence accelerates change. Humans alter landscapes faster than tectonic plates. They compress transformation into centuries rather than millennia. This has happened before. In quieter moments, one may sense the weight of continuity beneath personal experience. You inhabit structures built long before your birth. You inherit languages shaped by countless unnamed speakers. You participate in cycles larger than comprehension. The philosophical descent does not seek to unsettle, it seeks proportion. Empires fade, stories persist, patterns endure. Creation contains its own contradiction. Intelligence expands possibility. Expansion introduces fragility. Fragility invites adaptation. Time absorbs it all. There is no final catastrophe implied here. No predetermined collapse. Only acknowledgement that change is intrinsic to existence. Power fears what it produces. Perhaps the more precise statement is that complexity challenges control, and complexity is cumulative. Within this perspective, ancient myths appear less as warnings of doom and more as reflections of scale. They situate human striving within larger rhythms. They remind listeners that even divine narratives include recalibration. Memory survives collapse. The descent now approaches the threshold of quiet. The inquiry has traced patterns across continents and millennia. It has widened into psychology and deep time. What remains is not conclusion but awareness. Empires are brief, clay endures, and the questions inscribed in ancient script continue to echo, softly, across centuries. Before the narrative settles fully, it is necessary to return to discipline. Ancient myths are not encrypted scientific records. They are literary compositions shaped by theological, political, and social contexts. The Enuma Elish reflects Babylonian state ideology. Atrahasis encodes concerns of early urban societies. Hesiod's Ages of Man articulate moral reflection within archaic Greece. The Popol Vuh emerges from Mesoamerican cosmology after centuries of oral transmission. Each text belongs to its culture. Archaeology does not confirm divine engineering. Genetics does not demonstrate cyclical global annihilation. Geological data do not map neatly onto specific mythic chronologies. Correlation must not become assertion. Creation contains its own contradiction. The human mind seeks coherence. When patterns appear across cultures, it is tempting to infer singular origin or hidden continuity. Yet independent societies often generate similar narratives because they confront similar existential pressures. Mortality, environmental instability, social hierarchy, technological change. This has happened before. Scholarly method emphasizes material evidence, stratified layers, carbon dating, linguistic comparison. These tools ground interpretation. They prevent imaginative expansion from outrunning data. Power fears what it produces. Even this phrase, evocative as it is, remains interpretive. The ancient texts do not explicitly articulate systemic theory. They dramatize divine human tension in mythic language. Modern readers must resist projecting contemporary anxieties uncritically backward. Memory survives collapse. What can be affirmed with confidence is this: ancient civilizations reflected deeply on instability. They encoded awareness of growth, disruption, and recalibration within sacred narratives. Whether those narratives describe literal events or symbolic structures, they testify to enduring human concern with balance. The rational position does not dissolve wonder. It situates it. We can acknowledge geological upheaval, without equating it directly with flood epics. We can recognize demographic fluctuation without claiming cyclical extinction, can observe pattern without asserting hidden super-civilizations. Creation contains its own contradiction. The tension between expansion and fragility remains visible in both myth and history. That observation requires no supernatural framework. It arises from documented evidence of societal change. In returning to restraint, credibility is preserved. The clay tablet remains artifact, not oracle. The flood layers in sediment remain geological fact, not divine verdict. The king lists remain administrative record shaped by literary convention. Yet the patterns observed across them continue to invite reflection. Stability is provisional. Complexity is double-edged. Correction follows imbalance. These statements stand within empirical boundaries. The inquiry has widened deliberately. Now it steadies. It is possible to honor the power of myth without assigning it mechanical authority over history. Ancient narratives need not function as literal blueprints to retain significance. They operate as meaning-making structures, not scientific mechanisms. The Enuma Elish was recited during ritual festivals to reaffirm cosmic order. The Atrahasis Epic circulated among scribal schools as theological reflection. Hesiod's verses guided moral contemplation. The Popol Vuh sustained cultural identity through colonial disruption. These texts were not laboratory reports. They were frameworks for orientation. Creation contains its own contradiction. This phrase, drawn from pattern rather than inscription, captures the tension myth seeks to articulate. Human societies create systems to stabilize existence. Those systems generate unforeseen consequences. The cycle becomes narrative. Scholarly caution remains essential. Similarities between flood traditions do not require shared catastrophe. Recurrent decline motifs do not confirm lost golden ages. Environmental upheaval does not automatically translate into divine judgment. This has happened before. Interpretive enthusiasm can outpace evidence. Intellectual integrity requires boundaries. Archaeology grounds myth in context. Philology anchors translation in grammar. Geology constrains chronology. Yet meaning persists even within constraint. Power fears what it produces. Whether understood as divine apprehension or systemic tension, the image resonates because it reflects lived experience. Parents fear the independence of children. Leaders fear the unpredictability of masses. Innovators fear the unintended impact of invention. Myth condenses these dynamics into symbolic narrative. Memory survives collapse. The flood in text becomes a way to speak about loss, recalibration, and survival. The shortened lifespans in king lists signal transition from mythic expansiveness to human limitation. The ages of man acknowledge moral erosion without demanding literal chronology. In this stabilized frame, myth is neither dismissed nor literalized. It is interpreted. Creation contains its own contradiction. To create is to risk imbalance. To expand is to encounter boundary. These observations do not require hidden gods or forgotten continents. They arise from documented history and contemporary awareness alike. The rational position allows ambiguity to remain intact. It neither collapses wonder nor inflates speculation. It accepts that ancient people grappled with the same structural tensions we recognize today. This has happened before. Cycles of growth and correction characterize civilizations across eras. Myth provides narrative coherence for those cycles. Science provides measurable context. Together, they offer layered understanding. Power fears what it produces. The phrase can now rest without urgency. It is descriptive rather than accusatory. With interpretation stabilized, the descent can continue toward quiet. The museum lights dim gradually at closing time. Room 56 grows quieter. Visitors drift toward the exit. The glass case remains undisturbed, holding the clay tablet beneath steady illumination. K5419 rests as it has for decades, its edges chipped, its script preserved through centuries of burial and rediscovery. The rebels' blood mixed with clay, the gods deliberating, humanity shaped, regret following creation. Creation contains its own contradiction. Imagine standing once more before the tablet. The air is cool. The surface of the glass reflects faint outlines of surrounding artifacts. You lean closer, tracing lines impressed long ago by a human hand that has turned to dust. Power fears what it produces. Perhaps the phrase feels less dramatic now, more observational. The gods in the text are distant, yet their anxiety echoes familiar rhythms of growth and recalibration. This has happened before. Floods recede, cities fall, stories endure. Memory survives collapse. The tablet does not demand belief, it offers continuity. It carries forward awareness that intelligence brings responsibility, that expansion invites adjustment, that no system remains untouched by time. Breath slows. The clay holds silence well. In the quiet of night, the questions remain suspended without urgency. Why were humans created? Why did their creators fear them? The answers are not fixed. They shift with perspective, with evidence, with reflection. Creation contains its own contradiction. The phrase softens now, less assertion than recognition. To exist is to participate in cycles larger than comprehension. To think is to inherit both clay and something like fire. The museum will open again in the morning. Visitors will return. The tablet will remain patient, carrying forward its lines across generations. And the inquiry, like the clay, will rest, not concluded, but gently held within time. If these reflections linger with you tonight, allow them to settle quietly. There is no need to resolve them. Simply notice how ancient stories continue to shape the way you consider origin, power, and continuity.